Hey, it's time for TV Skywriter. There you go. There I am. Sorry, I had you clicked on there, Professor. Okay, here's the book. A Mind to Stay, White Plantation, Black Homeland. Welcome to this show, Professor Nathan.
Well, thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Really excellent book.
North Carolina, yes, I should say. Even
though so you're out west, right?
I live in Denver. I was living in North Carolina for 40 years, and I always loved it when it snowed, about 4 or 5 times.
Well, that's funny. Of course, it shuts the whole town down, but that's okay. But just talk about this book. I was reading. I didn't get a chance to read through the whole book. I'm really in suspense because I'm 3/4 of the way through, and it's like an academic thriller. I love the way it's. Oh, really? It's really wonderful. And all the way through, I'm wondering, how did he get all of this great information? First, why don't you tell us, if you don't mind, what the book is about?
So the book is about a people who were once enslaved, who were sent out to Alabama from a North Carolina plantation, which is now a state historic site, the Stagville Plantation, just outside of Durham, North Carolina. And they were sent out in the 1840s by a planter who wanted to get into the cotton business and to own that land and to send out these people absentee, 1844. So he sent them out there, and I went out on the trail to see if I could find the descendants to discover from oral history what their version of that forced migration was and what their experience was. When I went out there, I found them. And what I found is that they had stayed and they had bought the old plantation, which surprised the heck out of me. Why would anyone buy a plantation they used to live on? And they held on to it forever and to this day. So it became a bigger story. And you step back a bit and you realize that millions and millions of African Americans left the South, or forebears, lots of famous people's forebears, Oprah Winfrey, every black writer that you can name. But these were people who stayed. So I guess the bigger story was this is a counterpoint to the Great Migration. And the question is why people stayed. So that's what the story is about. People who stayed rather than people who left, and why they held on to the land and how they did it.
What was really interesting to me, just in the beginnings of the book, was your explanation on how, well, even though you did point out bondage is bondage, still was very interesting how it was illustrated how the Cameron family they were more, I guess you could say, a little nicer, and that they strove to keep the families together, the enslaved families together.
So not every slaveholding family and plantation family could do that, but they had been at it for 3 generations. They had means to buy people together and to keep them together. And they found out that this was a really good way to get people's compliance in a system that they would otherwise be totally resentful and resistant to. And as one black descendant put it, they stole your labor, but they kept you together. And so it wasn't altruistic, but on the other hand, they also realized it was better than beating up on people all the time. That people were aware of the fact that other slaveholders would get into debt or would send people away, punishment, or would split up the families when somebody died. And they were aware that this family kept people together. So I think that was the way in which it was a bondage, as I put it in a way that I meant to provoke, bondage with benefits. And we don't usually like that term. I didn't like it.
Bondage with benefits.
But it came out of my mouth and I thought, well, let's just lay it out there.
Now, I can imagine some black folks reading this book might feel just a slight pang of jealousy in a way, because this family was able to stay together. I suppose they're able to, if they wanted to, follow their roots all the way, maybe back to Africa, but at least back to where they entered this country. A lot of black people, of course, were separated to the point where they have no idea what their family names were. In fact, my family, we thought on my mom's side, all this time, all throughout our whole lives, we thought our families from my mom's side they were from Georgia, because my mom's mom and her mom were from Elberton, Georgia. We just assumed, since that's out east, that's where they entered the country. Found out later, just by doing a search on Bing of all places, we found a death certificate and discovered that, like this family you wrote about, my mom's family started in Virginia and they were sent to Georgia by a white family member who set up shop in another state, just like the family you wrote about.
So that happens. But when you have a big plantation like this, one of the benefits is that they have great records. They have this inventories, we would call it, of enslaved people every year. And it's partly for tax purposes and partly just to keep track of people. So it's a great way to sort of be able to follow the family connections over time, and to have a basis for going back further. Now, I have to say, I just gave the book to one of the younger descendants. Jessica Hargless is about 40 years old, maybe 30 years old. And she said, well, now, where do they come from? Where did the first, and I said, well, I didn't go back. She said, well, I'm going to.
Oh, good.
So it's exactly what you're talking about. I picked up the story in 1814 and then take it right to the present. And she said, well, she's going back behind 1814 there.
Oh, good for her. Good for her.
The Alabama story is really about how the planter thought he could transfer this system of bondage with benefits, of a more benign, keeping families together, that kind of what I would call a trade-off. He thought he could keep it up in Alabama. And what the story is that he's not able to do that. And in Alabama and then again in Mississippi, slavery just gets worse. And the attachment that people might have had, and in fact did have for a time, because he kept families together, it gets strained. So it's partly about that.
Plus, he was, like, as you explained, an absentee planter. He couldn't possibly really oversee the operations like he did here in North Carolina. Also, it seemed that the weather didn't seem to comply either.
No, he bought a plantation that he almost immediately felt betrayed into buying. A relative, of course, advised him, and you got to watch out for that. But it had actually 3 different kinds of soil. He didn't know that. So it had sandy soil, it had black loam soil, it had red clay. So the weather that was good for one part of the plantation was terrible for another part of the plantation, and vice versa. So in a sense, whatever the weather was, how could I put this politely? He got messed up.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was part of the story. But then, I'm for me, the exciting part once I got out there, first I found, I didn't know what I was going to find anybody when I went out to Alabama in 1978. Mm-hmm. Were you born in 1978?
Describe that, because that was really cute. How you had no idea when you made this life-changing phone call. Who was on the other end?
Right. So I knew the last name of one of the people who was on one of these lists that I was telling you about, the slave inventory, because most people just had first names like Pat and Sid and Judith and Tony and Virgil and that sort of thing. But this was one person on the list who had a last name, Hargis, Hargiss. And thank goodness it wasn't Harris. Harris is just a common name. Hargis is an unusual name.
Okay.
So I went out there, and I was hoping to see if somebody with that name was still around, and therefore was a person that I could make contact with, and then see if that person knew anything about the old days. Well, sure enough, I found that name in the census returns, 1870 up to 1900, 1910. And then I went out to Alabama, in Greensboro, Alabama, and I looked in the telephone directory, and there was a version of the name, Hargress. So they'd added a GR to that name. She's Alice Hargress. And I gave her a call, and I started telling her.
Okay, wait. Before you made that phone call, were you pretty sure that was the same family, or were you just hoping?
Well, I was hopeful. I wouldn't say I was sure about anything, but I was hopeful, again, because it's such an unusual name. And I knew that the name had changed from Hargis to Hargress before I went out. It had changed in the census.
Oh,
so
okay.
I knew that was the name. That was the right name. I just didn't know whether this was the right person. So I waited to make that phone call, and I let my stomach settle down. And then I picked up the phone, and I told this woman who answered that I was Sid Nathans, and I'd come from North Carolina, and the planter had sent people out to Alabama in 1844. And she just said, well, that's right. And then I said, and he left, and he left the people behind. And she said, well, that's right. And I said, can I come out and talk to you? She said, well, come on.
Come on.
So it was really a thrill. And I have to confess, I called home and I said to my children, I think I found my people.
Wow. That was almost too easy.
I was lucky. I would say I was just lucky. And then to come to find out that she didn't know anything about the slavery time story, but there was a person who lived on the land right down below where she lived named Louis Rainey. This man who was the oral historian in the community. And Louis, you can see him on his porch, sitting in his wheelchair. Louis grew up there, then he went away, got cut up in a dice game, got paralyzed in the waist down, came back. And so Louis knew the stories from his grandmother, who was a person who was there when the first Union soldiers said, "You're free." And Louis also knew the stories of all the elders who would come by on his porch and talk to Louis.
Wow.
So he knew the stories, he told the stories, he got the stories. So, I mean, if that's not luck, I don't know what is.
That's absolutely amazing.
So, and this is Alice Harkless, by the way, who is the person who told me to come on. And this is her at a family reunion with her AMEZ, African Methodist Episcopal Zion hat.
Awesome.
And you can see she's just a fantastic person. And she was my gatekeeper. So when she said to other people in the community, "Now you talk to that boy," they did.
So I'm just curious. So they know their family story in Alabama. Do they have any curiosity about Stagville here in Durham?
They did. They do. And as a matter of fact, Alice Harkless and I came to Stagville, and we visited there. And she was at one of the Methodist conferences, and I took her to the Cameron Grove Missionary Baptist Church, which is the church that the people who had been at Stagville founded first on the plantation, and then when they couldn't buy the land, then they moved off the plantation, but they kept the name.
Amazing.
So this was a kind of reunion of people from Alabama and North Carolina.
Unbelievable. That's astonishing. Now, if I'm not mistaken, again, I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Chicago, but I seem to remember reading somewhere that Stagville was actually inhabited by family members until the 50s, 60s?
Some lasted until the 60s. Most of them were leaving in the 30s. And a lot of the people who were, I mean, basically the Stagville story is not just a story of people who were enslaved, but people who lived there afterwards and lived in those Horton Grove quarters, which are now part of the State Historic Site, and lived there and grew up there, had pianos in the house, had dances on the lawn. So it's a story of freedom and people who were there in free times, as well as story of people in slavery times. So there was a nice reunion of people from Alabama and North Carolina in that time that Alice Harkless came.
So I suppose they would be very distant cousins, I suppose.
Very distant.
Yeah.
Yeah, very distant. I hadn't thought about that, but they would be distant. They would be distant. But I think the affinity was really one of knowing the history, because I had shared the Cameron history with the folks in Alabama and the story of people back in North Carolina, and I had shared some of the Alabama story with people in North Carolina. So in that sense, they both knew each other's stories through me.
Wonderful. Now, all the time I'm reading this book, I mean, you're quoting from letters. You have all this great information. I mean, you just casually throw out these dates. All this happened in 1814. And all the while, I'm wondering, this book took an awful lot of work. I'd like to know how you got started and how long did it take to put out a magnificent book like this. Again, it's called A Mind to Stay, White Plantation, Black Homeland. So, Professor Nathans, I'd like to know, how long did it take for you to do all the research for this book?
Does 40 years sound about right?
Wow.
No, I started this in 1978, and I went out to Alabama then. And for me, the oral history was the exciting part, the part that I could add. I knew how to use archives, but then I had to go back and forth between the interviews and the archives, because a lot of the stories I was getting were, let's say, not ones that I could verify. Let's put it that way. But ones I had to understand. So I've been back to the archives over the years since 1978, and for me, the challenge was trying to figure out how the parts connected, because I start out in slavery times and have the planters' records, so I can go back there. And these were planters who kept all their records and corresponded extensively.
Now you're saying archives, but where are these archives held?
So the archives are at the Southern Historical Collection at Chapel Hill, and they are now in the Wilson Library. They've been there since 1930. And wow. The Camerons were, in fact, the first large planters to donate their papers. The papers are, I always thought there were 90,000 letters. I was told by one of the archivists that there were only 30,000 letters. And I responded, well, maybe I thought it was 90,000 because I've been through them 3 times.
There you go. Can ordinary citizens look through this collection?
Yeah, no, it's the best collection on Southern history really in the country, and Duke is right behind it. But it's a wonderful collection, and anybody can go up and take a look. Wow. So I used those are the papers that I relied on for the most part, and then some others, but I kept going back to them as I had different questions. And they're beautifully organized, and the archivists are wonderful people and help me. And as I say in the acknowledgments, they never said aloud, "Why didn't you find it the last time?" which I really appreciated.
What was the most difficult part of writing this book? I can imagine that it was probably fun. I mean, I know we're talking about slavery. There's nothing fun about it. But I mean, the research, interviewing people, traveling to Alabama, it sounds like fun to me. And I'm wondering if there was anything difficult about writing this book. Or at least you make it seem like it.
The research is always the fun part. Then at some point you have to stop and say, hey, I got to write this stuff up. So the challenge was that there are stories, there are lots of people in the story. And so I finally had to and what held the story together. And it wasn't clear to me at the beginning that it was really a story of people staying on the land and a counterpoint to the Great Migration. It took me a while to figure that out, as well as the individual parts of the individual chapters. But the challenge was, okay, so by the turn of the 20th century, the cast of characters changes. All the people in the 19th century story, the 2 Pauls, Paul Cameron and Paul Hargis, and the people around them are gone. And now Alice Hargis and Louis Rainey and another man named James Lyles, they come into the story. So in the end, what I did was to basically make it a story of 2 pairs, the 2 Pauls in the 19th century and Alice Hargis and James Lyles in the 20th century. And what distinguished them is that these were the champions of holding on to the land.
Right.
They were not going to give up that land.
And getting involved in civil rights.
And finally, for them, holding on to the land was not just for themselves, it was for their children who went away to the north and to the west. Now, why in the world would they come back to rural Alabama if rural Alabama was just the absolute home of Jim Crow, which it was at that time?
Yeah.
And so that's when they had to come out of their sanctuaries and come out of their land and decide they were going to march and they were going to demonstrate and they were going to take the tear gas and they were going to get arrested, because they had to change the South and make their children citizens as well as residents if they were going to come back.
Wow.
So that's it's a lot to encompass, 1814 to 2014, from bondage to the civil rights movement and beyond. Just a lot. So I had to figure out how to pull it together. And in the end, it was 2 pairs, Paul and Alice Hargis and James Lyles, and the centering around both getting the land in the 19th century and holding on to the land in the 20th and 21st century.
Well, it's a masterful work. What are your plans for this book?
Well, I am coming to North Carolina next week, and I'm going to be at Stagville on the 18th, on Saturday, the 18th at 2 o'clock. And so very much I'm coming home. That's where it all began for me. And then I'm going to be at Quail Ridge in Raleigh on Monday night. And I'm going to be at Duke on Tuesday and Carolina on Wednesday and the Regulator on Thursday. So
wow, it's a full calendar.
It's going to be fun. And I'm going to see lots of friends and have a reunion with people who have helped me all these years. So that's the plan.
So if you don't mind telling us a little bit about Stagville, because I'm not from the South. My folks are from, like I told you, well, this is my mom's hometown, Durham. I have roots in Georgia. My father's family's from Alabama, believe it or not, Talladega. But I'm fascinated by Stagville, and I love the Great Barn, which I was told by staff at Stagville, if we have more, through the years, more hurricanes and whatnot, that very well might be the last building standing. Is built so well by what they call African genius boat building skills. However, it's hard for me to find a Black person here who's been to Stagville. Very often they say, "Oh, I'm not interested in slavery." It's not just about slavery. I wonder if you could just tell us the importance of Stagville.
Well, Stagville belonged at some point to the Camerons, and then it belonged to Leggett and Myers, and then it belonged to the state. And the state took it over Stagville and which is the Benahan House, 1798, and the Horton Grove slave quarters. Horton Grove slave quarters are a place where people lived. I think I think one of the persons who did interviews at Stagville said, people just didn't slave; they lived there. And the people who have looked at Stagville, George McDaniel, who was a graduate student at Duke, who wrote a wonderful book called Hearth and Home, and Alice Ely Jones, who've done interviews, have found out about the lived experience of people in bondage. So it was about a lot more than slavery. It was about singing. It was about keeping the grass off in the yards in front of the house so the snakes wouldn't come under. It was about sweeping the yards. It was about where things were orderly and put in the houses. So they found out that about bondage, but also about the people who lived there in after emancipation, in tenancy times. So it's really a site where Black people made it in bondage and then made it even better after bondage, and where they created this church, the Cameron Grove Missionary Baptist Church. And so the people that I interviewed following the trail of George McDaniel, actually people of great joy, and they would just talk about how they lived out there. Now, they would be the first to say we were poor, okay, but also, they had a lot of latitude. And I asked one woman, well, why didn't her father just buy the land or go off the land? She said, why would he leave? He made it here. He was a blacksmith, and and a lot of these people would have side trades. So he was a blacksmith, and he would make money that way. Sometimes they would go off to mines and make a little extra money to pay the rent. They worked out a modus vivendi with the people who owned the place. So I think it's about a lot more than bondage. And even when you're talking about bondage was not just about slaving, not just about working. It was about life that was lived under those conditions, and people who survived that and managed to come out okay.
I love that, and you're absolutely right. And as the staff, when you take the tour at Stagville, they do point out, again, the boat building skills of the people of African descent who built the Great Barn, but also how the stones that the houses rest on were built without mortar, and that took a certain amount of skill as well. And it's just interesting to see all that. I think it's really, really a fascinating place. And I actually invite anyone to walk over to the chimney that still stands. I know some of the buildings, a couple of the buildings I think were, I'm not sure if they're original or not, but the original chimney is there. And the thumbprints of the people who built the chimneys are still there. And it's an interesting act to put your thumbprint against the thumbprint of an enslaved person who built that structure. I just think it can be a very moving experience if you approach it the right way.
But I think I don't want to sugarcoat it. It was slavery, all right. And I say in the chapter in the middle, when slavery came to this emancipation came to this plantation, so did insurrection. That these people, threw off the mask and revealed their true feelings about bondage. Once it became clear that they couldn't just get the best deal that was possible in slavery, they were really going to be free.
That was interesting, because it seemed that the white former owners were surprised that they weren't more grateful.
Exactly. Yeah. So I read about this one episode where a white woman, a young white woman, 17 years old, speaks sharply to her house servant, to her domestic servant, and that woman just takes off her apron and says, "My hair is as straight as yours, and my skin is almost as white as yours, and I'm as free as you are." And she walks away.
Oh, so, Emma, the late young lady named Emma. Yeah, that was wild.
Yeah. So once bondage ended and emancipation was real, and it was real because Sherman's troops marched right into that plantation, then the people dropped their masks.
Yeah, I have never read an accounting. A lot of people think, oh, okay, well, the slaves were let free, and then they were free to go to, Harvard and buy apartments in New York. But the turmoil, the absolute turmoil of what happened when you're saying, okay, you're free to go, and not knowing where to go. And actually the white people, a lot of them were homeless, and they were wandering around as well. It was really interesting to read an accounting of a period where you go from everything totally and tightly controlled to what seemed to be utter chaos.
Well, I think from the vantage point of the black folks in this plantation, they think, okay, this place is ours now.
Yeah.
And we're going to set the rules. And then, there are weapons all around. And I end that particular section with the overseer saying, they are armed and so am I.
Yeah.
So
my favorite part was when one of my favorite parts, there's so many, there was a murder. A white man murdered a black man. And instead of rampaging and looting and pillaging, the black folks decided, okay, we're going to start voting now. We're going to get this together. And they got it together.
They did. That happened in Alabama, in Greensboro, Alabama. And they had a wonderful leader named James K. Green, who channeled everything into black political activism, and he got elected state senator.
Wonderful.
And somebody from this plantation got elected to the state representative. So
wow.
So it worked for a while.
We can go on for hours about this wonderful book, which, by the way, is called A Mind to Stay, White Plantation, Black Homeland. And already half hours passed, but I hope to meet you on Saturday when you're here at Stagville.
Well, that's great. I look forward to it, and I thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And thank your publicist. I will make sure that your publicist gets a copy of the show as well. Thank you so much, Professor. I really love talking with you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Okay.
And I thank my technical assistant. Are we off the air?
Not yet.
Not yet.
We are now. Okay, folks. So I'll say my quick goodbye. Okay, folks, you have a beautiful evening. Thank you so much for watching TV Skywriter. Be sure to read Durham, North Carolina's online community paper, the Durham Skywriter, at durhamskywriter.com. With that, have a great night. Ciao for now.